Sometimes you read a paper or a blog post or something and you think, yes, of course, that makes sense. But the more you dive into the topic, the more you find aspects of it that you did not grasp before, that were a little obscure. Words that mean something else in context than they mean in common use. The 3 speculative claims about neural networks is one such topic. So, what are these speculative claims? In order to study neural nets, to understand what they are doing and how, it is useful to have some sort of structure. In a similar way to how we study organisms by looking at cells, and how we can make larger, more abstract claims by knowing some general structures, the paper Zoom In, an Introduction to Circuits, sets out 3 claims about the internal structure of neural networks. These claims are speculative, because these claims are still being researched. Here they are, these 3 speculative claims, all listed out. Claim 1 is that features are the fundamental units of neural networks. They correspond to directions. These features can be rigorously studied and understood. Claim 2, circuits. Features are connected by weights, forming circuits. These circuits can also be rigorously studied and understood. Claim 3, universality. Analogous features and circuits form across models and tasks. Only a couple of sentences. Seems simple, right? I will spend the rest of the runtime of this video explaining these few sentences, going as deep into the materials and definitions as I think is necessary to understand what they mean. Before we dive into the topic, here is a short reminder on neural nets and how they work. If you are already familiar with weights, neurons, activations, and how a model gets trained, feel free to skip this part. I will not go into depth or discuss the mathematics, so this will just be a quick reminder of what a neural net consists of. When building a neural net, there are 2 main things you build it out of: neurons and weights. A neuron is an entity that can either be active or inactive. The neurons are organized in layers. Every neuron is connected to every neuron in the layer after it by weights. A weight has a value that determines how much and in what way the activation of the neuron in the earlier layer affects the activation in the layer following. If a value of a weight is large and positive, it greatly influences the other neuron to also be positive. But if it's small and negative, it slightly influences the other neuron to be negative. There is 1 weight per connection between 2 neurons, and since every neuron of a layer is connected to every neuron of the layer after it, that's a lot of weights. Training the neural net is basically trying to find the best values for these weights, such that you can get the result you want. How these best values of these weights are found is by complex mathematics. But how you can think of it is like starting at random values for these weights, and then changing them step by step in what seems to be the right direction. Now we are ready to move on to the 3 claims. I will start our investigation of the 3 claims by examining the 3rd claim. It is the easiest to grasp. This claim is that analogous features and circuits form across models and tasks. Another way to say this is that similar structures with similar functions will form in many different neural networks that perform many different tasks. A useful analogy is to compare this to studying organs in living animals. Many animals all have structures within their body that they use to see with. Eyes. There are many differences between snake eyes and human eyes, like the placement on the head, the shape of the pupil, the color. Still, they function basically the same way. Neural nets could have comparable structures too. An organ of a neural net might look different and have different properties than the same organ in another neural net, but it would have the same function. This claim is speculative, just like all of the other claims. It is more of a question than an established scientific truth whether similar structures form in different neural nets. If it were to be true, it would be useful though. Just like we can infer how mouse eyes that are almost too small to study work by studying pig eyes, or how we can do experiments on animals to understand more about their eyes, and therefore also understand more about human eyes, which would otherwise be unethical. We might be able to infer how one circuit in a large language model works by studying another model, possibly one that is much smaller and easier to understand. The extent of the universality is important. There are many different levels of universality that these structures could be at. Maybe all neural nets are very similar, as if they were a collection of mammals. There's many kinds of mammals, and most of them have eyes, and it makes sense to study mammal eyes in general, if you want to understand mammal vision. The eyes are similar enough that studying the eyes of one species of animal in particular contributes to understanding eyes in general. However, it could also be that the structures are much more different, like the differences between insect eyes and mammal eyes, or even the difference between human vision and plants being photosensitive. Since insect eyes are fundamentally different from mammal eyes, studying insects would not help understanding of human eyes much. If neural nets were as dissimilar to each other as these two different types of eyes, the field would need to focus its efforts more on understanding the few most relevant neural networks and their structures, instead of neural nets in general. The next claim we discuss is the claim about features. Features are the fundamental units of neural networks. They correspond to directions. These features can be rigorously studied and understood. Let's take it apart and start with the first part. What is a feature? In everyday language, a feature is something that stands out about a thing. If you were to describe an object on a website, for example, an important feature would be something that makes it different from the other objects of the same type. A feature of this book, for example, is that it has especially large letters. And a feature of this other book is the high-quality illustrations it contains. This is a way we can conceptualize features in neural networks as well, if we draw it a little more broadly. In the context of neural networks and AI, a feature is any distinctive property of an input. This can be human recognizable as distinctive, but it does not have to be. If the neural net does something very complicated, for example, such as AlphaFold, the protein folding neural network, we might not understand the distinctiveness of a property, but it can still be a feature. Some examples of things that can be features: a curve in a certain direction, the face of Taylor Swift, or the orientation of a dog snout. These are all examples of features in image-based neural nets. For text generators, a feature could be the letter I as used in programming books, the concept of the Golden Gate Bridge, the language Spanish, or the word di. So, features correspond to distinctive-ish properties of the input. Inside of the network, a feature would look like a couple of neurons that always fire together when a particular property is present. These features are, according to the claim, the fundamental unit. This means that features are the smallest individual thing that can be studied to understand the overall behavior of the neural network. This is different from thinking of neurons as the smallest thing worth studying. According to the claim, if you want to study the behavior of neural nets, it is not meaningful to study the individual neurons, but you have to look at the totality of the feature. Looking at one neuron of a feature firing might be like looking at the left wheel of a car to try and understand why traffic jams happen. It is looking at a part that is only meaningful in how it contributes to the whole of the car in the traffic jam or of the feature in the neural net. So that is the first bit of the first claim covered, but then the next sentence is, they correspond to directions. What does that even mean? For this, some background information is useful. Modern content generators are dependent on a particular technology, a variational autoencoder. This is a type of neural net developed to classify data, but it was later used to generate data as well. If we gloss over some mathematical details, A variational autoencoder has 3 parts. An encoder that takes an input and compresses it in some way, the compressed representation, and the decoder, which takes the compressed thing and transforms it back into something close to the input. Maybe the input is a list of numbers, a vector, of size 100, and it then gets compressed into a vector of size 3, and then gets expanded back again into a vector of size 100. The size of the vector we also call the dimensionality. The vectors above are 100-dimensional, 3-dimensional, and 100-dimensional again. The model is trained to produce the same output as input, which should force it to encode information in a compressed way. The middle area here, the low dimensionality space, described by the vector of 3 numbers, is called the latent space. It can be considered as a coordinate system, with as many dimensions as there are numbers in the vector, 3 in this case. These 3 numbers can have all different kinds of values, and every different value for each of these 3 numbers is a different point in the space. And every point in this 3-dimensional latent space corresponds back to the 3 numbers, a 3-dimensional vector. And those 3 numbers, the 3-dimensional vector, can be put through the decoder to produce an output. In real autoencoders, the input dimensionality can be in the hundreds of thousands, and the latent space, while compressed, could still be in the thousands of dimensions. This makes sense. The latent space is just a vector, and a vector is just a list of numbers that can be as long as we want to make it. However, if we want to visualize how this works, we usually simplify this low dimensionality latent space into 2 or 3 dimensions, since that is much easier for our brains to understand than something with thousands of dimensions. Within the latent space, features correspond to directions. I will show here a 2-dimensional plane. This latent space visualizes the low dimensionality vector that we get in the middle of our autoencoder. We pick a point on this latent space and let it be transformed into an image through the decoder. Let's say that this point here would be transformed into this circle. Then a feature, maybe angledness, would correspond to a direction of a plane, like an arrow pointing somewhere. Traveling along that arrow would give our output image more and more squareness, as we can see here. Another example of features being directions. Say a gray triangle corresponds to this point, and a gray square to this one. If we find that the red triangles are over here, and we get a direction error that corresponds to the difference between the two, then that arrow corresponds to the feature shape is red. If we then add that feature to our gray square, we would find a red square. This also means then that to the AI, everything is made up of these features. The face of this dude on the right is just made up of different combinations of all of these other features that the neural network has found. Any image is just all of these different features combined and added up, subtracted. To an AI, perceiving is just complicated linear algebra. In text, the intuition is slightly different. Text works with word embeddings. Every word is encoded to be a long list of numbers. This encoding is usually learned separately. In the first layer, the words of a text are processed straightforwardly. The words that come in are directly encoded into a vector. The sentence, "Hi, I'm studying the 3 speculative claims," would be one list of 7 elements, and at every spot in that list would be a vector. This vector has a certain dimensionality, that is just the amount of numbers in the vector. In the first layer, words are processed without context, just in the order that they are written. In the next layers of the model, the features that are dependent on context are added. In the earliest layer, for example, the model might detect the word present or present as a feature. If we imagine the latent space again as 2 dimensions, and not tens of thousands of dimensions, present might be located right here. In later layers, the model is able to add context to this word by adding features. It would distinguish, for example, as meaning gift by the sentence, I gave her this book as a present. But in another case, it would add the feature to show, as in, I presented my work. In later layers, it would even be able to distinguish the context of the action as a feature. So that would be the difference between, I presented my work at a conference. The other researchers were very impressed. This has the context of an academic setting. While, I presented my work. My mum said my stitches were not even enough. Would be in a familiar handworking setting. The more context is taken into account, and the more context features are added. The last claim we will be investigating is the claim about circuits. Features are connected by weights, forming circuits. These circuits can also be rigorously studied and understood. If you know something about neural nets, or you were paying attention to my short description at the beginning, this might seem obvious. Isn't this just explaining the basics of how neural nets work? However, there is more to this claim than you might initially think. The main idea of circuits is that these individual features on the different layers of the neural net inhibit and excite each other in complex ways that form basically an algorithm. This can occur between two or many layers, and in most architectures, features in lower, earlier layers stimulate features in higher, later layers, in such a way that you can observe some kind of interplay that leads to more complex features. Features can excite or inhibit each other, depending on the connections or weights between them. If the weights between a feature in an earlier layer and a later layer are positive, the earlier feature will excite the later feature, and if it's negative, it will inhibit it. If a feature excites neurons in a later layer, it makes it more likely that that neuron will be active, and if it inhibits it, it makes it less likely to be active. If you want to detect a car, seeing wheels makes it more likely, and seeing bare feet makes it less likely. It is, however, a little bit more complex than just there are wheels present and there are no bare feet. Usually an image of a car does not have wheels in the highest section of the image, for example. So, seeing wheels in the upper part of an image might inhibit the car detection. An example of circuits in vision models is a dog head detector. In a lower layer, it detects noses and fur that are either left or right facing. It detects that independently. It then has a left facing snout feature, which stimulates the left facing head feature. It makes it more likely that a left facing dog head will be detected. And it inhibits the right facing dog head feature. And it also works the other way around. The left facing head feature then again stimulates the left-facing dog profile feature, so a dog with a head and a neck, and inhibits a right-facing dog head plus neck feature. So now you are separately detecting a left and a right-facing dog head. The model then basically says, if there's either a left-facing dog or a right-facing dog head, then there is a dog head. We don't care which side the dog is looking at. This seems like a pretty complex algorithm and almost like someone designed it, but no one did. This is behavior that has been observed in these models and that develops inside of these models, almost grows organically there. So, what were those three claims that we were investigating? The first claim says that there are features that are not neurons, that are the smallest unit that is relevant to study within neural nets. A feature is a distinct-ish aspect of the input, and it corresponds to a direction in the latent space. This also implies that every input of a neural net is just some complex linear algebra. These features can be studied and understood. The second claim says that these features form circuits together, structures that function as algorithms to build up more complex meaning. Features do that by inhibiting and exciting each other in particular ways, through their weights. These circuits can also be understood. The third claim is that these features and circuits are universal in some sense. Structures of similar function form in different models that are built for different tasks. This implies that, if we study the features and circuits in one model, we can use that knowledge to understand other models. Those were the 3 speculative claims. If you thought that all is interesting, then make sure to check out my list of sources in the description. They'll go a little bit more into proof and into depth about how it actually works. Thank you for listening, and if you're one of the people on this list, thank you for helping me and making it possible for me to make this video.